If you listen carefully to Robert Johnson's recordings, really listen with headphones in a quiet room where you can focus on every layer of sound, every nuance captured by those primitive microphones in those makeshift studios in Texas in 1936 and 1937, you'll hear something beneath the guitar and the voice, something that shouldn't be there, a sound, a noise, a presence in the audio that exists in every single one of his 29 recorded songs. It's faint, easy to miss if you're not paying attention, or if you're listening on poor quality equipment, or if you're focused on the music itself rather than on what exists around the music, behind it, woven through it like a thread connecting all 29 recordings into a unified whole. The sound is always there, always present, always the same, and nobody has ever been able to definitively identify what it is, where it came from, or why it appears in every recording Robert Johnson made, despite those recordings being captured on different days in different sessions using different equipment in different rooms. The recordings were made during the sessions. The first session took place in San Antonio, Texas, in November of 1936. Robert Johnson traveled to San Antonio at the invitation of Ernie Ortle, a talent scout who worked for the American Record Corporation and who had heard Robert playing in Mississippi and recognized his exceptional talent. The session was held in a makeshift studio on the third floor of the Gunter Hotel, a respectable establishment in downtown San Antonio that catered to business travelers and occasionally rented out rooms for special purposes. The recording equipment was primitive by modern standards but state-of-the-art for the time. A single microphone connected to a disc-cutting lathe that would inscribe the sound waves directly onto a master disc made of acetate or aluminum. No magnetic tape existed yet. No ability to edit or overdub or manipulate the recording after the fact. What you played into the microphone was what got permanently inscribed onto the disc. If you made a mistake, you had to start over with a fresh disc. The process was unforgiving and expensive, with each master disc representing a significant cost that had to be justified. By producing a saleable recording, Robert Johnson recorded 16 songs during that first San Antonio session over a period of 3 days in late November. He worked with Don Law, a British-born producer who had been hired by ARC to oversee recording sessions in the South and Southwest, traveling to various cities to capture regional music that could be marketed to specific audiences. Law was experienced and professional, had recorded numerous blues and country artists, understood the technical requirements of the medium and the commercial requirements of the market. He set up the microphone, positioned Robert at the proper distance, explained how the recording process would work, and then let Robert play. The room they used was a standard hotel room with the furniture pushed aside to create space. The walls were covered with heavy blankets and drapes to dampen echo and reduce ambient noise that might interfere with the recording. The windows were closed and covered. The goal was to create as quiet and controlled an acoustic environment as possible, given the limitations of recording in a hotel rather than in a purpose-built studio. Robert sat in a chair facing the corner of the room, his back partially to the microphone. This positioning was Don Law's decision, based on his observation that Robert seemed shy and uncomfortable when facing the equipment directly, that he played better when he could partially hide himself, when he could pretend he was alone or playing in a more intimate setting rather than performing for a mechanical device that would preserve and reproduce his music. The corner position also helped focus the sound, reduce the amount of room ambience captured by the microphone, created a more direct sonic path from Robert's guitar and voice to the recording apparatus. Between takes, Law would listen to the test pressings, evaluate the quality, decide whether the performance was good enough to keep or whether another attempt was needed. Robert was nervous during these sessions, uncertain about the recording process, worried about making mistakes, aware that this was his chance to create something permanent, something that could reach audiences he would never meet in places he would never travel. The 16 songs recorded in November 1936 represented a selection of Robert's repertoire. Some were his own compositions, original blues that he had written and refined during his years of traveling and performing. Others were his versions of traditional blues songs, standards that every blues musician of that era knew and played, but filtered through Robert's unique style and technique, transformed by his supernatural skill on the guitar and his intense emotional delivery. The songs covered the standard blues themes: love and loss, betrayal and loneliness, travel and rambling, hard times and harder choices, the supernatural and the sacred, the profane and the spiritual, all mixed together in the complex stew that characterized Delta blues at its most authentic and raw. Each song was performed in 1 or 2 takes. Robert would play it through, Law would evaluate whether it was satisfactory, and they would either move on to the next song or attempt another version of the same one. There was no budget or schedule for extensive experimentation or perfectionism. The goal was to capture good performances efficiently, to produce master discs that could be manufactured into commercial releases, to turn Robert Johnson's talent into a product that could generate revenue. When the 16 songs from the San Antonio session were released on various singles over the following months, they sold modestly in the regional markets where blues records found their audience. Nothing spectacular, but respectable enough that ARC was willing to bring Robert back for another session. That second session took place in Dallas, Texas, in June of 1937, approximately 7 months after the San Antonio recordings. This time the location was a warehouse that had been temporarily converted into a recording studio, a large open space that provided more room than the hotel setup, but that also presented different acoustic challenges. The same basic equipment was used, the same single microphone setup, the same disc cutting process, the same technical limitations and requirements. Don Law again supervised the session, working with Robert over the course of 2 days to capture 13 additional songs. These recordings showed Robert's evolution as a musician and songwriter. More confident than he had been in San Antonio, more comfortable with the recording process, more willing to experiment with dynamics and phrasing, more in control of his performances. The 13 Dallas recordings completed Robert Johnson's recorded legacy, 29 songs. Total, 16 from San Antonio plus 13 from Dallas. These would be the only commercial recordings Robert Johnson would ever make. Less than a year after the Dallas session, he would be dead at age 27 under mysterious circumstances in Greenwood, Mississippi. The 29 songs would be all that remained of his music beyond the memories of people who had heard him play live and the influence he had on other musicians who learned from him. But those 29 recordings would prove to be enough. They would be rediscovered and reissued in the 1960s, would influence a generation of rock and blues musicians, would establish Robert Johnson as one of the foundational figures of American music. Every major rock guitarist from the 1960s onward would cite Robert Johnson as an influence. His recordings would be studied and analyzed. His techniques would be dissected and emulated. His songs would be covered by countless artists. Those 29 tracks captured in primitive conditions in makeshift studios in Texas in 1936 and 1937 would become some of the most important and influential recordings in the history of American music. But they contain something else besides the guitar and the voice, something that nobody noticed at first. In the 1930s, when the recordings were new and the technology for listening to them was limited to scratchy 78 revolutions per minute records played on wind-up phonographs with acoustic horns or simple electric speakers, the background noise was there from the beginning, captured on the original master discs, but it was buried under the surface noise of the recording medium itself, hidden beneath the hiss and crackle that characterized all recordings of that era. It wasn't until decades later, when the recordings were remastered and transferred to modern media, when audio engineers used digital technology to reduce surface noise and enhance the clarity of the original material, that the background sound became clearly audible to careful listeners. And when people finally heard it clearly, when they could isolate it and analyze it and compare it across all 29 recordings, they realized something impossible. The same sound appeared in every recording, every single one, despite being recorded months apart, in different locations with different equipment and different acoustic spaces. The sound is difficult to describe with words. Audio engineers who have analyzed it extensively struggle to characterize it precisely. It's not a hum or a buzz like you might expect from electrical interference. It's not the rumble of traffic or the sound of wind or rain or any identifiable environmental noise. It's not the sound of other people in the room, not voices or footsteps or the rustling of clothing or papers. It's more organic than mechanical, more complex than simple, more structured than random. Some people describe it as a low rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat, but not quite. Slightly irregular in its timing, varying in intensity, but never stopping, continuing underneath the music from the first note to the last. Others describe it as a breathing sound, an inhalation and exhalation pattern that seems to match the rhythm of the music, but independently, as if something was breathing along with Robert's playing, but with its own respiratory cycle. Still others hear it as a kind of whisper or murmur, not words exactly, but vocalization. The sound of a voice or voices speaking too quietly or too distorted to make out specific words, but clearly intentional communication rather than random noise. The most sophisticated analysis has been done using modern digital audio processing tools that can isolate specific frequency ranges, that can enhance quiet sounds and suppress louder ones, that can visualize audio as waveforms and spectrograms that reveal patterns invisible to the ear alone. When audio engineers apply these tools to Robert Johnson's recordings, the background sound becomes more visible, but no more explicable. It occupies a specific frequency range, mostly in the lower mid-range between roughly 100 and 500 Hz, with occasional harmonics extending higher. It has a consistent spectral signature across all 29 recordings, meaning that whatever is producing the sound has the same tonal characteristics in every instance. The amplitude varies, sometimes louder and sometimes quieter, but the fundamental character of the sound remains constant. It pulses or oscillates with a period of approximately 1.3 to 1.7 seconds, not a perfectly regular rhythm, but confined to that range, creating a pattern that repeats throughout each recording with slight variations in timing and intensity. The impossibility of this sound existing in all 29 recordings becomes clear when you understand the circumstances under which those recordings were made. The San Antonio session and the Dallas session were separated by 7 months and approximately 300 miles. Different buildings, different rooms, different acoustic environments, different ambient noise signatures that should be unique to each location. Yet the background sound is present in recordings from both sessions with identical characteristics. More significantly, the recordings within each session were made over multiple days with equipment being set up and torn down between sessions, with different master discs being used for each song, with no continuous recording that would carry sound from one track to another. Each of the 29 recordings is a separate discrete event, captured on a separate piece of media, with no technical connection between them. Yet the sound appears in all of them as if it was part of the recording environment itself, as if it traveled with Robert Johnson from song to song, from session to session, from San Antonio to Dallas, from November to June, manifesting consistently regardless of external circumstances. Don Law, the producer who supervised both recording sessions, was interviewed extensively in the 1960s and 70s, when Robert Johnson's music was being rediscovered and re-evaluated. Law was asked about the recording process, about Robert's demeanor and working methods, about any unusual occurrences during the sessions. In a 1973 interview, Law mentioned something he had never discussed publicly before. He said that during both the San Antonio and Dallas sessions, he had been aware of a sound in the room that he couldn't identify, not loud enough to be a serious problem for the recordings, not disruptive enough to stop the sessions, but present. A kind of low atmospheric sound that seemed to intensify when Robert was playing and diminish during breaks. Law said he had checked all the equipment for mechanical noise, had investigated possible sources of sound leakage from outside the recording space, had done everything he could think of to identify and eliminate the noise, but he never found a source. He eventually decided it was probably just the acoustic characteristics of the rooms they were using. some quirk of how sound behaved in those particular spaces that created a low-level ambient presence that the microphone was picking up. But Law also said something else in that interview, something that suggested he had never been entirely satisfied with that explanation. He said the sound seemed to follow Robert. When Robert moved position, even slightly, the sound seemed to maintain its relationship to him rather than to the room. When Robert paused between songs, the sound would diminish but not disappear entirely, as if it was waiting for him to resume playing. Law described feeling uncomfortable about this at times during the sessions, feeling like there was something in the room with them that he couldn't see or identify, something that was interested in Robert's music, something that wanted to be present for the recording. He never articulated this feeling to Robert or to anyone else involved in the sessions, because it seemed too strange, too irrational, too much like superstition rather than professional observation. But decades later, when asked about those sessions and about Robert Johnson as a person and a musician, Law admitted that there had been something unusual about the recording environment, something he had noticed but had never been able to explain or fully understand. Other people involved in or present during the recording sessions reported similar perceptions. A man named Caldwell, who owned the equipment that was used for the Dallas session and who was present as a technical assistant, mentioned in the 1980s interview that the recordings had captured sounds that he didn't remember hearing in the room at the time. He said that when he listened to the test pressings during the sessions, he noticed a low background sound that seemed more prominent in the playback than it had been in the live performance. He attributed this to the microphone being more sensitive than human hearing in certain frequency ranges, picking up sounds that were present in the room but below the threshold of conscious perception for the people there. But he also said there was something strange about the quality of that background sound, something that didn't quite match any of the usual noises you would expect in a recording environment. He couldn't describe it more precisely than that, couldn't say what it sounded like or what might be producing it, just that it seemed odd in a way that stuck in his memory decades later. The recordings were released and circulated, were played on jukeboxes and radios and phonographs throughout the South and beyond, were heard by thousands of people over the years. Following their release, most listeners never consciously noticed the background sound. They heard Robert Johnson's guitar and voice, heard the songs and the performances, heard the surface noise and technical limitations of the recording medium that were universal to all recordings of that era. The background sound was there, present in every playback of every copy of every record, but it was subtle enough that most people's attention didn't register it as distinct from the general acoustic environment of the recordings. But some people noticed. Some listeners, especially musicians who were paying close attention to every detail of Robert's playing, who were trying to learn his techniques and understand his approach, heard something beneath the music, a presence, a sound that seemed to pulse or breathe or move in ways that didn't match the guitar or the voice or any identifiable aspect of the recording. A blues musician named Johnny Shines, who had traveled and performed with Robert Johnson and who knew him personally, listened to the recordings after they were released and mentioned to other music. IANS that there was something in those recordings that reminded him of being in a room with Robert when he played, not the music itself, but something else, an atmosphere, a quality to the air when Robert was performing. Shine said that sometimes when Robert played, especially when he played his most powerful songs, the songs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than normal creativity, it felt like the room changed, like something arrived or manifested or became present that hadn't been there before. Shines couldn't describe it more specifically than that, couldn't say what it was or what it meant, but he recognized something similar in the recordings. A sonic quality that suggested Robert had not been alone during those sessions, that something had been present with him, listening or watching or participating in some way that got captured by the microphone and preserved on the master discs. In the 1980s and 90s, as digital remastering technology advanced and Robert Johnson's recordings were transferred from the original 78 revolutions per minute records to CD format, audio engineers worked to clean up and enhance the sound quality. They used sophisticated noise reduction algorithms to minimize the hiss and crackle of the old records, used equalization and filtering to balance the frequency response, used digital processing to extract the maximum clarity and fidelity from source material that was nearly 50 years old and had been created with primitive equipment. During this remastering process, the background sound became much more audible. What had been a subtle presence, buried under surface noise, became a clearly distinct sonic element that could be heard by anyone listening carefully. And when engineers compared the sound across all 29 tracks, they confirmed what some careful listeners had suspected. It was the same sound in every recording. Not similar, not comparable, identical. The same waveform pattern, the same frequency distribution, the same rhythmic characteristics, appearing in every single track despite those tracks being recorded months apart in different locations under different circumstances. This discovery prompted investigation and analysis. Audio forensics experts were consulted. Engineers with decades of experience in restoration and remastering were asked to evaluate the recordings and explain the presence of this consistent background sound. Various theories were proposed and tested. Perhaps it was artifact of the recording equipment, some mechanical noise produced by the disc-cutting lathe or the microphone preamplifier, or some other component of the signal chain. But the equipment used in San Antonio and Dallas was not identical. Different models of microphones, different lathe assemblies, different electronic components. Any mechanical noise would be specific to the individual equipment and would vary between the two sessions, yet the background sound is identical across both sessions. Perhaps it was electrical noise from the power supply, a hum or buzz at 60 Hz or 120 Hz. That was common in electrical recordings of that era, but analysis shows the sound doesn't match the harmonic structure of power line interference. Its frequency content is more complex. Its rhythm is irregular rather than steady. Its characteristics don't correspond to any known form of electrical noise. Perhaps it was acoustic feedback, the microphone picking up its own output through some kind of loop. But the recordings were made using direct disc cutting with no amplification or monitoring speakers in the recording room. There was no feedback path that would create a loop. Perhaps it was resonance in the room itself, some architectural feature creating a standing wave or acoustic mode that the microphone captured. But the two recording locations had completely different dimensions and construction. They would have completely different resonant frequencies and acoustic signatures. Yet the sound is the same in both locations. Perhaps it was sound leakage from outside the recording spaces, traffic noise or mechanical equipment or some other external source. But the buildings and locations were different. The ambient noise environments would be unique to each location, and the sound doesn't match any typical environmental noise source. Perhaps it was cross-contamination during manufacturing, some sound getting imprinted on multiple records during the pressing process. But the sound appears on the original master discs, the unique first-generation recordings that were created directly by the lathe in the recording room. It's not a manufacturing artifact. It was there from the beginning, captured during the original recording sessions. Every technical explanation that has been proposed fails to account for the evidence. The sound is too consistent to be random, too identical across different sessions to be environment-specific, too complex to be simple mechanical noise, too organic to be electrical interference, too persistent to be accidental contamination. It exists in all 29 recordings, with characteristics that suggest a single source that was present during all recording sessions despite those sessions being separated in time and space. Some audio analysts have suggested the sound might be intentional, might be something Robert Johnson added to his recordings deliberately, through some technique or process that is not obvious from the recordings themselves. Perhaps he used some kind of drone string or sympathetic resonance in his guitar that created a low sustained tone underneath his playing. But analysis of his playing technique and the physical characteristics of acoustic guitars shows that such an effect would not produce the sound that is heard in the recordings. The sound is too low in frequency, too independent of the guitar's pitch and rhythm, too consistent across different songs in different keys with different tempos. The most disturbing characteristic of the background sound, the aspect that makes it most inexplicable and most unsettling to people who study it carefully, is how it responds to Robert Johnson's performance. The sound is present throughout each recording, but its intensity and character vary in ways that seem related to what Robert is doing musically. During instrumental passages, when Robert is playing complex guitar figures, the sound often increases in intensity and becomes more active in its pulsing or breathing rhythm. During vocal passages, when Robert is singing, the sound often becomes quieter and more subdued, as if it is listening, rather than participating. During moments of particular emotional intensity, when Robert's voice becomes more strained or his guitar playing becomes more aggressive, the sound sometimes develops additional harmonic components, becomes richer and more complex, as if it is responding to or reflecting the emotional content of the performance. This responsiveness suggests intelligence or intentionality, suggests the sound is not passive background noise, but an active presence that is aware of and reacting to the music being created. In the early 2000s, a team of audio researchers used advanced signal processing techniques to isolate the background sound as completely as possible from Robert Johnson's recordings. They used multiband compression and expansion, used spectral subtraction and adaptive filtering, used every tool available to separate the background sound from the guitar and voice, and create a version of the recordings that contained only that mysterious presence. The results were eerie and disturbing. When you listen to just the background sound removed from its musical context, you hear something that is clearly not random noise. It has structure, it has rhythm, it has patterns that repeat and vary in ways that suggest purpose or meaning. It sounds like something is speaking or singing or breathing, producing vocalizations that are just at the edge of being comprehensible, that seem on the verge of resolving into words or music but never quite do. Some listeners find it unsettling in a primal way, triggering an instinctive sense that they are hearing something they should not be hearing, something that was not meant for human ears, something that exists in a realm adjacent to, but separate from normal auditory experience. One researcher who worked extensively on isolating and analyzing the background sound described the experience of listening to it for hours as profoundly disturbing. She said it created a sense of being observed or accompanied, a feeling that something was present in the room with her even though she was alone. She said the sound seemed to have an emotional quality that changed depending on which song it was extracted from. The sound from recordings of Robert's more troubled or dark songs felt oppressive and heavy. The sound from recordings of his more hopeful or spiritual songs felt lighter and more ethereal. The sound seemed to carry or reflect the emotional content of the music it accompanied, as if it was not just present during the recording, but participating in it, contributing to it, shaping it in ways that were captured by the microphone, but that operated below the level of conscious perception. This researcher eventually stopped working on the project because she found the experience too psychologically taxing, too disturbing to continue exposing herself to. For the long hours necessary to complete the analysis, the background sound has never been definitively explained. No theory has been proposed that accounts for all of its characteristics. Its presence in all 29 of Robert Johnson's recordings remains one of the genuine mysteries of recorded music history. Some people dismiss it as simply an artifact of old recording technology, something that can be explained technically even if the specific explanation has not yet been identified. Others believe it represents something genuinely anomalous, something that suggests Robert Johnson's recordings captured more than just music, but they captured something about Robert himself, or about what accompanied him, or about the forces he had access to that gave him his supernatural talent. The sound is there. It can be heard by anyone with good equipment and careful attention. It is identical across all 29 recordings. Despite those recordings being made under different circumstances, it responds to Robert's performance in ways that suggest awareness or intelligence. It has defied all attempts at definitive explanation, and nobody knows what it is. The question of what the background sound might represent has generated numerous theories over the decades since it was first clearly identified and analyzed. Some theories are grounded in conventional explanations, attempting to find technical or environmental causes that could account for the sound's presence, despite the apparent impossibility of such causes applying across both recording sessions. Other theories venture into more speculative territory, suggesting that the sound represents something paranormal or supernatural, something connected to the legends and stories about Robert Johnson that circulated during his life and that have persisted long after his death. The most prosaic explanation is that the sound is simply an unidentified, but ultimately mundane artifact of the recording process, something produced by the equipment or the environment that audio engineers have not yet recognized because they lack complete information about the specific circumstances and technical specifications of the 1930s recording sessions. This explanation has the advantage of not requiring any acceptance of impossible or paranormal phenomena. It assumes that given enough information and analysis, a conventional explanation will eventually be found that accounts for all the observed characteristics of the background sound. However, this explanation struggles with the fundamental problem of consistency across different sessions. Even if some specific quirk of the recording equipment or process produced the sound, that quirk would need to be present in both San Antonio and Dallas, in equipment that was not identical, in rooms that had different acoustic properties, across a span of 7 months during which equipment would have been transported and set up and potentially serviced or modified. The probability of such specific and unusual artifacts being identically reproduced across such varied circumstances is vanishingly small. Every piece of equipment has its own unique sonic signature. Every room has its own acoustic characteristics. For identical sound to appear in recordings made with different equipment in different rooms requires either an incredible coincidence or a source that is independent of equipment and environment. A more technical explanation suggests that the sound might be related to the master disc cutting process itself, to some physical characteristic of how the lathe stylus inscribes grooves into the recording medium. Perhaps some vibration or resonance in the cutting mechanism produces a low-frequency noise that gets imprinted along with the audio being recorded. But analysis of other recordings made using similar disc cutting technology from the same era does not reveal similar background sounds. If it was a characteristic of the technology itself, it would appear in other recordings made with similar equipment, yet it appears to be unique to Robert Johnson's recordings. The fact that it is specific to Robert Johnson's work suggests that the source is somehow connected to Robert himself, rather than to the recording technology or environment. This leads to speculation about what aspects of Robert's presence or performance might have created or attracted the sound that was captured. One theory proposes that the sound is related to Robert's playing technique, to some physical property of how he held or played his guitar that created vibrations or resonances that the microphone captured in ways that were not audible in the room, but that registered on the sensitive recording equipment. Acoustic guitars produce not just the notes that we hear as music, but also a complex array of harmonic overtones, sympathetic vibrations, and physical sounds from the instrument's construction and the player's contact with it. Perhaps some aspect of Robert's unique technique produced low-frequency vibrations that were below the threshold of normal hearing, but that were captured by the recording equipment. But this theory fails to explain why the sound is independent of the guitar's pitch and rhythm, why it continues during vocal passages when Robert is not playing guitar, why it maintains consistent characteristics across songs in different keys and different tempos. Another theory suggests that the sound might be acoustic feedback or room resonance related to Robert's voice, some unusual quality of his vocal production that excited resonant frequencies in the recording space in ways that created sustained tones or oscillations. Human voices can create powerful acoustic effects in enclosed spaces, can drive room modes and standing waves that modify and enhance the sound in complex ways. Perhaps Robert's voice had some characteristic frequency or harmonic content that interacted with the rooms in San Antonio and Dallas in ways that produced the background sound. But again, this theory struggles to explain consistency across different rooms with different dimensions. and different resonant frequencies. And it doesn't explain why the sound is present during instrumental passages when Robert is not singing. A more psychological or perceptual theory suggests that the sound might not be in the recordings at all, but might be a form of auditory pareidolia, the tendency of human perception to find patterns and meaning in random stimuli. Perhaps listeners who are primed to expect mystery and strangeness in Robert Johnson's recordings unconsciously interpret random noise as structured, meaningful sound. Perhaps the background sound is not actually consistent across recordings, but only seems consistent because people are finding what they expect to find, creating patterns from randomness. This theory is undermined by the objective evidence from digital analysis. The sound is not random. It has measurable, consistent characteristics across all recordings. Its frequency content, its rhythmic patterns, its response to Robert's performance. All of these can be demonstrated objectively through spectral analysis and waveform comparison. It is not a subjective interpretation, but an objective phenomenon that exists in the recordings, independent of listener expectations or beliefs. Moving into more speculative territory, some theories propose that the background sound represents something genuinely anomalous, something connected to the supernatural aspects of Robert Johnson's legend. The most common version of this theory suggests that the sound is evidence of demonic or spiritual presence, that Robert Johnson's music was accompanied by forces from another realm that were captured, incidentally, by the recording equipment. According to the famous legend, Robert Johnson gained his musical ability through a deal with the devil at a crossroads, trading his soul for supernatural talent. If this legend has any truth to it, if Robert's music genuinely involved some kind of supernatural compact or connection, then perhaps the background sound in his recordings is evidence of that connection, an acoustic signature of forces that were present during his performances and that manifested in ways that recording equipment could capture even if human observers could not perceive them directly. This theory has the advantage of accounting for the otherwise inexplicable consistency of the sound across different sessions and its apparent responsiveness to Robert's performance. If the sound represents some entity or force that was attached to Robert or that accompanied his music, then it would naturally appear in all recordings of his work regardless of when or where those recordings were made. It would respond to his performance because it was aware of and engaged with what he was doing musically. It would have characteristics that seem intelligent or intentional because it would be intelligent and intentional, not a passive artifact, but an active presence. However, this theory requires accepting premises that most people would consider impossible or at least unverifiable. Premises about the existence of supernatural forces and their ability to manifest in physically measurable ways. A related but slightly different theory suggests that the sound might represent some aspect of Robert Johnson's own consciousness or life force, some emanation from him that the recording equipment captured along with his music. This theory draws on ideas from various spiritual and metaphysical traditions that propose human beings generate subtle energies or vibrations that are not normally perceptible, but that can be detected by sensitive instruments under certain conditions. Perhaps the intense focus and emotional investment that Robert brought to his music created some kind of bioacoustic field that radiated from him, and that was picked up by the microphone. Perhaps what we hear in the background of his recordings is not an external presence, but Robert himself, some layer of his being that existed alongside his conscious musical performance, and that got preserved on the recordings. This theory would explain why the sound responds to Robert's performance, why it varies in intensity and character depending on what he is doing musically, why it appears in all of his recordings, but not in recordings by other artists. It would suggest that the recordings captured something uniquely personal to Robert Johnson, some signature or essence that was specific to him as an individual. However, like the supernatural theory, this explanation requires accepting premises about human consciousness and bioenergy that are not supported by conventional science, and that most people would consider speculative at best. Some researchers have proposed that the sound might be a form of electronic voice phenomenon, a category of unexplained sounds that sometimes appear in recordings, and that some people interpret as voices or communications from spirits or from some other realm. Researchers claim that recording equipment can sometimes capture sounds that were not present in the physical environment during recording, sounds that represent attempts at communication from non-physical entities. If this phenomenon is real, then perhaps Robert Johnson's recordings captured such communications, sounds from some presence that was trying to make itself known, or that was simply manifesting in proximity to Robert and his music. The rhythmic pulsing quality of the background sound, its apparent responsiveness to the music, its seeming vocalization or breathing characteristics, all of these would be consistent with interpretations of the sound as attempted communication or as the acoustic signature of a non-physical presence. Critics of this theory point out that EVP evidence is highly controversial and disputed, that most purported examples can be explained as misinterpretation of random noise or as artifact of the recording medium, that there is no scientific consensus supporting the reality of voices or communications from non-physical sources. However, defenders of the theory argue that the background sound in Robert Johnson's recordings is more consistent and more clearly structured than typical EVP examples, that it shows characteristics that are difficult to dismiss as random noise or misinterpretation, that it deserves serious consideration as potential evidence of anomalous phenomena regardless of how such phenomena might be explained or categorized. Another approach to understanding the background sound focuses not on explaining its source, but on understanding its meaning or significance. Even if we cannot determine with certainty what is producing the sound, we can perhaps understand what it represents symbolically or what it suggests about Robert Johnson and his music. From this perspective, the sound might be interpreted as evidence of the cost or consequence of Robert's talent, a sonic representation of what accompanied or followed him as a result of the choices he made to pursue musical mastery. The legend of the Crossroads deal explicitly involves payment or consequence for supernatural gifts. If Robert Johnson did make such a deal, then perhaps the background sound represents the presence of what he bargained with, a constant acoustic reminder of the compact he entered into, a shadow or companion that was with him always, including during his recording sessions. The sound would then be interpreted not as random artifact, but as meaningful evidence, as documentation of spiritual or supernatural reality that existed alongside Robert's physical musical performance. From this symbolic perspective, the fact that the sound is present in all of Robert's recordings, but is subtle and easy to miss, unless you listen carefully, might itself be meaningful. It suggests that the supernatural or spiritual dimensions of his music were hidden just beneath the surface, present for those who had ears to hear, but obscured for casual listeners who only attended to the obvious surface aspects of the performance. It suggests that Robert's music operated on multiple levels simultaneously, that what was captured in those recordings was not just technical performance, but something deeper, something that resonated in frequencies and dimensions beyond normal musical expression. The responsiveness of the background sound to Robert's performance might be interpreted as evidence that the supernatural and the musical were intimately connected in his work, that they were not separate domains, but aspects of a unified reality in which his playing was simultaneously musical craft and spiritual practice, simultaneously entertainment and ritual, simultaneously human expression, and something beyond human. Whether you interpret the background sound as technical artifact or as evidence of anomalous phenomena, whether you believe it represents supernatural presence or bioacoustic emanation or electronic voice phenomenon or something else entirely, the fundamental facts remain unchanged. The sound exists. It is present in all 29 of Robert Johnson's recordings. It is consistent across different sessions separated by time and space. It has characteristics that suggest structure and intentionality rather than randomness. It responds to Robert's performance in ways that seem aware and engaged, and it has never been definitively explained despite decades of analysis by skilled audio engineers and researchers. These facts make the background sound one of the genuine mysteries of recording history, something that challenges our understanding and that resists easy categorization or dismissal. For listeners who are aware of the sound and who pay attention to it while listening to Robert Johnson's recordings. It adds an additional dimension to an already powerful and mysterious body of work. It suggests that these recordings captured more than just music, that they preserved some trace of whatever extraordinary forces or circumstances surrounded Robert Johnson during those few days in Texas in 1936 and 1937 when he committed his genius to wax and created a legacy that would influence music for generations to come. The background sound serves as a sonic question mark, an audible reminder that there are aspects of Robert Johnson and his music that we may never fully understand, mysteries that persist despite investigation and analysis, elements of the story that remain stubbornly resistant to complete explanation. Whether those mysteries point toward supernatural realities or simply toward the limits of our knowledge and understanding, they add depth and resonance to music that was already profound and affecting. They remind us that Robert Johnson's recordings are not just historical artifacts or technical achievements, but windows into a life and a talent that were genuinely extraordinary, genuinely unusual, genuinely touched by something beyond the ordinary. Every time someone puts on one of those recordings, every time those songs play through speakers or headphones, the background sound is there, pulsing, breathing, responding, persisting, a constant presence that has accompanied Robert Johnson's music from the moment it was first captured until now. From those makeshift studios in Texas to every listening room and concert hall and digital player, where those songs continue to be heard, the sound is always there, in every song, never changing, never explained, never understood. A mystery preserved in audio, a question encoded in waveforms, an impossibility that you can hear with your own ears if you listen carefully enough. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps it's appropriate that Robert Johnson, whose life and death and talent were all shrouded in mystery and legend, should have left behind recordings that contain within them something that cannot be fully explained, something that resists understanding, something that keeps the mystery alive in tangible, audible form for anyone who cares to listen.